Rhema family, good evening and welcome to Live at 5 for the second installment of the Where Do We Go From Here series. We have an exciting conversation planned this evening and a group of incredible panelists as we tackle the subject, education and the Black experience. Before we go further, I invite you to bow your heads with me as we open in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we come before you now and we say thank you for the gift of your presence. We're grateful for the gift of your grace. We are grateful for the fact that you are with us as we are having this conversation, that you are with us as we are watching this conversation, that you are with us where we are. You meet us in the place that we are, and you enable us with the power, the strength, and the hope to move forward. So I pray in the name of Jesus that as we have this conversation, I pray that it would be insightful. I pray that it would be impactful. I pray that you would get the glory out of our time together. We pray that you would have your way and that someone would leave enlightened, that someone would leave encouraged, and that someone would leave with strategy today. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So for those of you who don't know, or if this may be your first time tuning in, my name is Elder Meikle Tulloch, and I am the leader of Plugged In, the youth and young adults arm of Rhema Christian Ministries in the great city of Toronto, Canada, where Pastors Orim and Pastor Judith Meikle are our senior pastors. So as I said, tonight we have a great conversation planned with these incredible individuals to the left of me and to the right of me. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce you to these great speakers. Starting with my left, we have Kwame Lennon. Kwame Lennon is an elementary principal in the Toronto District School Board. He has over 20 years of experience as an educational assistant, teacher, curriculum leader, and administrator in both elementary and secondary panels. Kwame has been an active leader of committees at the family of schools, system, and provincial levels. He also holds a master's degree in sociology and education from the University of Toronto. So in the chat, I'd invite you at this time to put some hands together for Mr. Kwame Lennon. Great to have you, Kwame.
Thank you for having me.
And beside Kwame, to my left, we have Giselle Thompson. Giselle is a doctoral student in the Department of Sociology at York University and will be defending her dissertation in September of 2020. She is a member of the Alpha Kappa Delta International Sociology Honor Society and is the 2018 recipient of the Pavo and Aino Lukari Human Rights Award and the 2019 recipient of the Grace and David Taylor Graduate Scholarship in Caribbean Studies, which are two of York's Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean's most prestigious awards. Giselle's current research examines how national debt and austerity affect public primary schooling in Jamaica. Her other research interests include anti-colonialism, Black Studies, Diaspora Studies, Globalization, International Development, International Financial Institutions, and Political Economy. Let's put our hands together for Miss Giselle Thompson. And to my right, we have Stella Isaac. Stella is graduating from York University in English and professional writing. She represented York as a varsity athlete, worked as a writing tutor for all varsity athletes, and was a sports writer for York University. Creatively, she was the coordinator for the Black History Month supplement for the school paper and created a publication for the Black Student Alliance. She is currently in the in-between of working toward graduation and discovering what is next, relying on God for now and for the what's to come. Let's put our hands together for Ms. Stella Isaac in the chat. Stella, we're grateful to have you joining today's conversation. And finally, Mr. Dexter Morris. Dexter is a vice principal with the TDSB. He has spent his career advocating for and with students and families of historically marginalized communities. His experience both as a student and educator in high-priority neighborhoods continues to fuel his passion for systemic changes in education. His work is centered on equity and closing the achievement gap for Black students with a particular focus on Black boys. As vice principal, he's committed to supporting educators in furthering their understanding of barriers that prevent certain groups from achieving in the educational system, and he continually engages educators in professional development that leads educators to challenge practices that create barriers. He is committed to ensuring that all student voices, interests, and identities are connected to their educational experience with love and with compassion. So I'd invite you at this time to put your hands together for Mr. Dexter Morris. Grateful to have you, Dexter. So before we start tonight's conversation, it's worth noting that 2 Saturdays ago, July 4th, we began having the conversation within this forum, the Where Do We Go From Here series, welcoming our very own Pastor Orim Meikle, Dr. Andrea Davis, and Dr. Michelle Johnson for a conversation surrounding Jesus, racial injustice, and the church's response. One of the things that I said before we concluded that conversation was that this conversation is one that cannot end in one talk, but as there are many layers, as there are many facets to things like systemic and anti-Black racism, and as we endeavor to see change, to be a part of the work to accomplish that change, there are layers and levels to this. So with that being said, tonight, I'm excited to have this conversation with each of you as you are influencers and educators in your respective right, and you have the perspective and the knowledge, the experience within the world of education. We know education, it shapes the minds, it shapes the futures of the rising generation. So with that being said, I am reminded of a quote by Maya Angelou, and I'll share it to open with the first question. She says, "The more you know of your history, the more liberated you are." And it's safe to say that our understanding or our misunderstanding of the past undoubtedly affects how we perceive ourselves and live within the present as we journey toward the future. So Dexter, I want to open with you with this question. Looking within the educational sector, being a vice principal within the Toronto district, what are some of the dangers that occur when Black students are exposed to a limited or a one-dimensional view of their history? And just to add some context, when I phrase this question, I'm thinking of things like the notion that history, that Black history, begins with slavery, or the view that African Canadian history is somehow different from Canadian history. It's a separate element and not a part of the Canadian historical experience. What are some of the dangers and the difficulties with that?
Thank you for that question. First of all, I'm very honored to be able to be a part of continuing this discussion. I did tune in 2 weeks ago, and if people who are watching haven't tuned in, hopefully they'll get a chance to see it, because that lays the foundation for this conversation. And it's very, very important and very powerful that we make sure that we're not starting, especially when we speak about Black history, African history, history of the diaspora. It's important that we don't start from slavery, because that's not where our histories start from, right? So even as when I was a classroom teacher, I always made sure that I always looked at the students that were in my space. I took the time to get to understand and know them and their lived experiences, their lived realities, and from that, figuring out how to incorporate that and connect them with their families. I think that our society, the way in which the schooling system is currently structured, it's structured upon Eurocentric histories. It's structured upon principles that eliminate or that do not discuss or even look at the positive impacts that we've had within society. And as a student growing up, we were regulated to only finding out or hearing about our histories during African Heritage Month. Right. And it was also very stereotypical. It was only about slavery. It was only about pretty much the American experience. Nice. And it really took away from the fact that Canada was implicit and had many, many roles in history where our people within Canada have been oppressed, have been treated unequally within society, right? So to answer the question, without us having our histories and knowing the full stories of what has happened and where we come from, it takes away from your ability to see what you're capable of attaining. If you are regulated to only thinking that you can be an athlete or you can be an entertainer, and you don't have that connection and understanding that you can be a creator, you can be an inventor, and that there's so many different domains of influence you can engage in, then students only think to go to that, right? You go to what you see or what you know.
Right, because the one-dimensional a one-dimensional view of history, it kind of limits the way that you see yourself and your people. Would any of the other panelists like to speak to that?
Absolutely. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I heard Maya Angelou's quote, and I thought about like the word liberation and what that means, and it means to be free from something. And when we, as Black people, know our history, we can be freed from the stories and the histories that this country keeps on telling us. Right. And also, my mom, makes sure that I'm very vocal about this. I'm of Haitian descent, and Haitian people, and my ancestors fought for our freedom and fought for our liberty and in the Haitian Revolution. And so me, as a person of Haitian descent, walking around with that knowledge, it does something. It makes me know that my people fought for me, fought for my freedom, and whatever that means. And that was for all of us, right? And so when you know your history, when you know, where you come from, and it's interesting that Canada or even the United States likes to start Black history with slavery, but even within the Canadian context, the presence of Black people in Canada didn't start with slavery. And that's so important, and that's in our records, and that's in the archives. And like in 1608 with Matthew da Costa, right? He wasn't an enslaved person. And so, yeah, it's really important for us to know our history, where we come from, in order to inform us of ourselves. And like you said, Dexter, like the possibilities of the self. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Giselle, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I do. I agree with both of you in so many different respects. You made a point, Dexter, that I wanted to explore further. We can also produce knowledge, and we can also set standards. And I think oftentimes when that narrative of our history only being that of enslaved individuals, it's so problematic. The authenticity of our history is not known to us as a result of its marginalization. So I think we had a discussion about previously about like black intellectuals, and when we don't see ourselves in those capacities, we perceive that we can't be those things. Those are for those sorts of occupations, people that produce knowledge. Black people don't do that. And also the narrative of our suffering is something that we can accept as something that's normal. I think we accept that when we only know of a history of slavery. So very, very important points that you've made that I certainly agree with.
No, that's a powerful point, especially what you mentioned about suffering. I think that's a good segue for our next question. And Kwame, I'm going to pose this one to you. We look at, as we're discussing the power of knowing our history, and we look at the way that black men, black women, black people, black bodies are represented within the media. I mean, we see that there is a normalization and almost an entertainment with the visibility of black pain, of black suffering, and even the spectacle of the killing of black people. I mean, conversations and activism we've seen it emerge in a different way. Not to say that it has not happened before, but most recently following George Floyd's killing. I mean, we opened our last conversation with that, and the trauma of watching that 8-minute, and I believe 46-second clip. And he's not the only individual we've seen like that. We've seen so many others, and it's almost normalized as entertainment. And my question to you is, as an educator, how do you think that this view of, or this normalization and this entertainment of black suffering, of black pain, and of the killing of black bodies, how does that influence the minds of the students within the classroom?
Thank you so much for the question, Elder McCarron, and thank you so much for inviting me to this panel discussion today. What came to mind when I thought about that question is the impact on the psyche. Just a few days ago, I decided to disconnect from social media because I had to self-reflect, and I said, you know what, I can't watch anymore, I can't hear anymore, because it's just doing too much to me right now. One of the pitfalls of, going back to the first question, of beginning with the narrative of blacks in slavery is the issue of the inferiority complex that sets in.
Right.
So going to their second question, what happens is when we just continue to portray black bodies in this way, what happens is that we begin to believe that we are inferior. Our bodies are inferior. Our minds are inferior. Our experiences are inferior to that of the dominant group in our Canadian and American societies.
Wow.
And our children begin to internalize that at a very early age. So when they don't experience success in the classroom or outside of the classroom, there are many reasons for that. And a part of it is, look what's happening outside of the classroom through the media. And, you say, well, what's happening inside of the classroom, inside the school? Am I seeing success? Am I experiencing success?
Right.
I remember when I was 8, I wanted to change my name, which is an African name, to a Canadian name.
Wow.
And I said, well, Mom, I want to be called Richard. And for a little while, I started to call myself Richard. And I didn't want to be Kwame anymore. But when I came to know who I was and my identity as an African man, I embraced my blackness. I embraced my first name. And 10 years ago, I went to the continent of Africa, and I tell you, that was a life-changing experience. But just to your point there, it really affects who we believe that we are, and it sets us up as being inferior, which is problematic at an early age.
Wow. And I would even add to what you shared, that I can imagine that at times what we see within the classroom with youth acting out in ways that are deemed to be disruptive may actually be a cry for help, a cry for belonging, a cry for someone to see them, to see their humanity, to see and to affirm their blackness. And I'm kind of interested, and this is open to all of the panel, in navigating that cry within the classroom, because I know that it is seen at the elementary level, it's seen at the junior high, and at the high school level, and I imagine, Giselle, even at the undergraduate level as well. And my question is, as educators, with the reality of black suffering and being able to identify with that, as an educator, but also having been a student as well, what are some of the ways that educators can ensure that they are supporting their black students both within and outside of the classroom? And that's open to anyone. Dexter?
I'll take that. I'll start it off. So I always say to other educators, to people I discuss, most of the times in the classrooms, when we see students that are acting out or have behavior issues, it's usually not behavioral issues. It's an engagement issue. So our system, our board, generally has engagement issues. And that is because students like myself, that look like myself, are disengaged with the material that they're being presented, right? So if you don't see anything that is of interest to you, you don't have an opportunity to share your personal views or your experiences, there's a disconnect. If it's not something that you don't see yourself represented in the work that's in front of you, right? So for me, and I think it's important to have to share personal experiences, because there's, in my school board and throughout Canada, there's studies that have been going on for 40 years that show the disengagement, the dropout rates or the push out rates that happen specifically to black boys, but throughout the system and to indigenous people as well. And I know when I was a student, when I was growing up, I wasn't engaged. I didn't like school. I didn't like what I was experiencing. I just went through the motions because I was going through school. And I didn't have the language to articulate how I felt and what I was experiencing. It's not until I became an adult that I looked back and I realized that I was this way because there was nothing that connected me to the learning. I wasn't interested in it. And the bigger piece as well is that I didn't feel like most of my teachers cared or believed in me. And again, as a young child, they may not always have the language to articulate that in a nice, eloquent way. Right. However, their actions show that sometimes. You don't care about me. You treat me bad. I see how you treat the other students. Why am I going to listen to or respect you? Right? So I think that's a piece that happens sometimes when students don't feel or see themselves or feel connected to what they're learning. They act out in ways to pass time, to get along, and then also if you're not being taught, right? Sometimes what happens as well is teachers can't figure it out and are frustrated, and it's just better to, you go over here and you work on something else, right? And then those students start to fall behind. From year to year, you go on to the next grade, and then students just develop coping mechanisms, right? So the behavior, okay, I might get sent out, I get to go in the hallway, or I don't have to show that I can't read, right? I'm hiding, I'm protecting myself
it's a way of
from the ridicule.
Almost.
Yeah.
Wow. That's so good. And I imagine even at the university level, Stella, what are some of the ways that is felt or that is perhaps seen within the realm of university?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of the teachers that I have, most appreciated, or all of the classes that I did really well in, I had professors and teachers who have, who pushed me, who saw potential in me and didn't let me give up on myself. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Even if I can go back to elementary school for a second.
Absolutely.
I was an unruly child in elementary school. I was not engaged at all. I didn't really pay attention. I got like good grades, A's and B's, but I wasn't paying attention in class, and I got disciplined from time to time for that. But I had this one teacher in grade 5. He was not putting up with it, not at all. And we were a school with mostly black students, so, many of us would get punished, sent to the office, etc. But that teacher, he was like, you guys are going to learn. So he put a stop to it. He put a stop to, my behavior and me not listening in class or me acting out in class. Maybe I wanted attention. My sister was in the same class as me. She's a year older. It was a 5 and 6 class. So she was the calm one. She was the one who respected everyone. All the teachers were like, Meikle is amazing. And I was like, I'm not going to be that. I was like, I'm going to be the complete opposite. And then he's like, actually, you're not. So, oh man. And all of my friends who have had that teacher, everyone that I know who's had that teacher, we always speak highly of him because he saw the potential in us and really cultivated, whatever it is that was in us. And even at the university level, I know that I can easily be, and I was really disengaged with some material. I'm an English lit student. A lot of the literature is white. A lot of the professors are white. I was not interested at all. And a few things happened, which I'm sure I'll get to sharing, but I felt like dropping out at one point. I was about to drop out. I think it was September 17th. I was about to drop out because I was really fed up with the whole institution. Yeah.
And may I ask, what kept you going? Was it a particular teacher that you were able to confide in, that understood and was able to support you? Was it was it remembering some of the teachers that had supported you throughout your journey and who had seen and spoken to the potential in you? I'm interested in kind of hearing what that was, because I'm sure that the same sentiment that you have expressed is something that so many watching can identify with.
Right. It was really God in that moment, like God putting the right teachers in my life at that time, who understood my experience in class. And I'll just share it. I had a professor in my second year who said the N-word in the classroom in American literature, and he said the N-word in the classroom, and there was this whole experience. And English, again, is a very white program. There were just a handful of black students, and I knew them all. We were all friends. And so that whole experience was very dehumanizing because I went up to the professor and asked him to stop saying the word. I was very uncomfortable with it. And he dismissed me completely and said, I have to go teach my tutorial. I don't have time. Come see me in my office. And I was like, he thinks that I'm going to go to his office and speak to him, and he's speaking to me like this in public? Absolutely not. And there was this whole, experience of me I had to go see the associate dean because I was about to drop the course, and my academic advisor was like, who was a black woman who's literally saved me, who was like, you're not dropping this course. And then she sent me to the associate dean, and they completely dismissed what I was feeling and had me explain why a professor saying the N-word in the classroom is problematic. Anyways, the following year was the year I wanted to drop out, and I didn't because I wanted to. My mom said, if you're going to drop out, you have to do something else. I went to George Brown. They said, you're overqualified. Go do what you're actually interested in. Wow. And so that's when I joined the track team with my amazing coach, and everything was a little bit better. Yeah.
Wow. I just have a question. Was that professor a tenured professor?
Yeah.
See, this is, I won't say that I have a problem with that, because I'd be a hypocrite if I said that I'm not trying to eventually become a tenured professor myself. But institutionally, things like that, he can dismiss you because he is tenured. Yeah. He can do what he wants to do. It's essentially, he's above, quote unquote, university law, so to speak, if such a thing were to exist. We can be discriminated against, and there are protections put in place. Right? So again, I'm not surprised that that happened to you. Yeah. I can share a similar experience as a graduate student. I was in a biopolitics class. I will explain that at a later date. And we were talking about someone who is a parrhesiast, which is a fearless speaker. It's a Latin word for fearless speaker. So I decided to, as I often do, practicalize the theory so it makes sense to normal human beings, in the discussion. And I said, Malala Yousafzai, for instance, the young woman that was shot by the Taliban in Pakistan for going to school, I said, she's a fearless speaker. She stands up for her belief that girls should be educated or what have you. And my teacher looked at me, and there was only 2 racialized students in the class, myself, being a black woman, my friend, brown woman. She looked at me and she's like, that's sloppy thinking. You owe the theorists more respect than that. So I looked at her and I said, excuse me, she's like, you owe the theorist more respect than that. Some things ought to dwell in the realm of theory. Not everything needs to be practical. So, of course, I was highly offended by this and borderline frightened, because usually my natural response is to say something.
Right.
But I was so surprised because the day previously, being that it was a biopolitics class, 2 other students were talking about the life forms of germs and bacteria, cats and dogs, not that those things aren't important, so to speak, but she was almost salivating at how interesting it was.
Wow.
And how, wow, what an interesting way to bring theory to life. And we were talking about germs in a petri dish. Meanwhile,
She was totally dismissive.
completely dismissed me and told me that I was thinking sloppily. For a graduate student, you owe theorists more respect than that. You're a doctoral student. That's not how you should think. So I did end up speaking to my program supervisor later than I should have, because at the moment, for black students in the academy, there is no real support. So you don't really know where to turn or who to turn to. And again, these are tenure track professors, so nothing's going to happen to them anyway. So you feel like kind of sort of trapped.
Right.
So I spoke to my GPD, graduate program director, and she's like, oh man, I wish you would have said something. We could have addressed it. Addressed, again, but I know what address means.
Right.
It's a conversation. Right?
But
nothing can truly happen. And just to be very brief, historically, we know that education is not for people of color. It was not for black people, right? From the academy right down to primary level education. It was a colonial tool to subdue. First, it was for, to meet the needs of white sensibilities, et cetera, so on and so forth. And then in the years post-emancipation, particularly in the Americas, we have all these free people, right? All of these children growing. We need to find a way to subdue them in service to the plantation economy, right?
Right.
Never mind getting into, the tertiary level. So these systems are historically not for us. So this is why today we have so many challenges in these spaces, and it doesn't get better when you get into graduate school, right? The politics are quite different. You might be able to have the discussion more broadly, so to speak, but systemically these things don't change because of little tiny things like tenure in that space, because they can get away with, many professors, I shouldn't say they, sometimes can get away with murder in that respect. And I've experienced it on more than one occasion. That's only one of many experiences I've had in the academy.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I thank you both for sharing that, because I know that there are so many that can attest to the frustration of having had experiences and attempting to raise it and address it with the professors that have been perpetuating those perspectives, only to be dismissed. Only to be dismissed.
Yep.
And you said something, you said a lot of these things, they happen at a systemic level. And Kwame, I want to pose this question to you. I want to ask if you could provide us with a bit of definition, because I know that we're familiar, but in case somebody's watching and they're wondering, what is systemic or what is anti-black racism? What do we mean when we speak of that? Can you just provide some clarity as to what that is and what that looks like?
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we have that on a slide to share. Elder McCaird, can we share that on a slide?
Okay, for sure. Can we have the slide shared speaking to the definition of anti-black racism? I think they should have it up shortly.
is in the media, social media, and regular forms of media, there is a lot of discussion about anti-black racism. And I think it's important for us to realize that at the core of it, it's about the inferiority or the perceived inferiority of black people or people of African descent. So when you think about academia, when you think about K-12 education, when you think about the experience of people of African descent in the education sector, that will lend itself to the notion that we are less than intellectually, we are less than socially, we are less than financially. And again, that's internalized by many. And the challenge is when you begin to study the history of colonization, you will realize that, yes, the education system was not created for us originally. So when you experience, professors or teachers that have this, expectation that we are less than, then it's very challenging to confront and to combat. So I just wanted to provide this one definition of anti-black racism, but also what's not seen in this definition is that anti-black racism is often invisible to the wider society.
Absolutely.
It's rendered invisible. Sometimes you're saying something or doing something and you're not even certain that you are actually
Don't even know.
complicit in this belief that blacks or people of African descent are inferior.
Yeah.
And I think that with what you shared, I would dare say that it's possible, if we're not careful, even as black people, to firstly internalize these views and replicate and perpetuate them. And I'm reminded, Kwame, of around 5 years ago, 2015, there was a young lady, 13 years old. I believe she was in grade 8 at the time. And some of you, I'm sure you probably saw the story in the Toronto Star, where she was kicked out of her class and sent to the principal's office. And the reason why she was is because of the fact that her natural hair was somehow seen as unprofessional. It was not professional enough, or it was not proper enough. And the irony of the story is that she was called out of class by a black principal. And my question is, and in fact, I'll pose this one to you, Giselle, but it's open to everyone. How can educators do a better job, black educators in particular, of not becoming what we're running from, right? In desiring to be professional and sometimes accepted, it can come to a place where there's a denial of the uniqueness, the beauty, and the power of blackness, so as to be accepted by the wider society.
Oh boy,
So the question is, how can educators guard against that and ensure that they are not perpetuating some of those same things within their practice?
This is a very important question because we have been shaped by the colonial, and we are continuously being shaped by it, and it defines everything in our lives. And as it pertains to beauty and our perceptions of beauty as black women, how black men perceive black women as well, it's being shaped by colonial sensibilities. And unfortunately, too many of us have embodied the colonial.
Right.
And perceive that if it doesn't look Eurocentric, it is not correct.
It's not proper.
It's not proper, right? I mean, we're socialized by watching cartoons. Disney, things of that nature. Even the first black Disney princess, her hair is not even natural, right? So our understanding of what beauty looks like has been set. A tone has been set historically. Before you and I got here, what beauty looked like was set into motion. And too many of us, again, have embodied that, and we carry that into our praxis. And it's very, very problematic. I think, to respond to your question now specifically, we have to now be aware of that and be willing to acknowledge that it has, the colonial has shaped us. But I was, interestingly enough, watching an interview with someone a few years ago. I don't remember her name specifically, and she said something very problematic. She said, well, we are in a Eurocentric lifestyle, and because we are, I accept that, therefore we should conform. So there are those people of color, black people rather, who are okay with it and just say, well, it's brought us this far, it is what it is. We're centuries far removed from slavery. Yeah, I understand that, you know, there's a certain politics of black hair that, you know, have brought us to this point, you know, the whole line of demarcation between, it's not just hair, we know complexion is another discussion, colorism is a thing, right? So that's another conversation. Some of us have embodied it to the point where we're okay with it, right? Others are not aware, and sincerely just not aware that it's, again, these are the legacies of colonialism that continue to perpetuate themselves, and we need to be aware. That's what I think we need to do. Be more self-reflexive, engage in conversations, and people like myself, who I have a few black friends who are educators, we need to check each other.
Absolutely.
Right? We need to engage in these conversations to make sure that we haven't embodied that, and make sure that we're not perpetuating that in our spaces.
Right.
It's very, very important.
Right, because some think that it's impossible to move forward without denying self, without denying the blackness that they embody. That there has to be a denial of that in order to be accepted, in order to be affirmed, and in order to occupy positions of authority.
Absolutely.
Would any of the other panelists like to speak to that?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. It's just really interesting to think, or, you know, it's interesting that a black woman, a black person in a position of power would say that to, you know, a student. But it's not surprising, like you said, like we've internalized these things. Yeah, I mean, for a long time, me personally, I wouldn't wear my hair out naturally. It was just one time my teammates were helping me undo my braids, and they're like, the only way we're actually going to finish this is if you wear your hair natural. And I was like, and so it was that bet, it was that challenge that made me, you know, go out and start wearing my hair natural and not wearing braids all the time. And even some of the little kids that I watched, this little black girl, she's 10 now, but at the time she was 5. And I was her babysitter, and she was at school and she was wearing her hair natural and her afro. And then one day I saw her and she didn't have her hair out in an afro. And I said, Sumi, what's going on? How come you're not wearing your hair out? Oh, I don't want to. I just don't want to. And I asked her mom, and a kid at school had said something. A kid at school told her that her hair is crazy. And in that moment, I knew that I had to tell her otherwise. I had to tell her, no, you are beautiful. She did challenge me and say, well, how come you don't wear your hair out? Right? Because she had to see that representation too. And I said, I will. And I did. And so I think it's really important for us to know what our responsibilities are as well for the future generation and for the younger kids, but also to check yourself.
Yeah, and as black women too, just if I could say another thing, I think we, in addition to being self-reflexive to make sure that we don't perpetuate these things in the classroom, we need to make sure that we're okay with ourselves, right? So when I get up before my students to teach, I wear my hair natural. Right? And I'm not saying that everybody has to do that necessarily, but for me, it's almost a statement, you know? Interestingly enough, I also teach in the social service worker program at Seneca College, and I had a student, it was in the more rural campus in King, which is a predominantly white campus, and, you know, this one student, we were talking about hair and also skin complexion, and she's like, you're black, but not really. And this is a diversity and awareness class.
Wow.
These are our future social workers. So I said, oh, okay, what do you mean by that? Right? She's like, well, you know, you speak a certain way and you are educated. Didn't you say you're doing your PhD or something? Okay, so you're educated. So like, okay, that's not.
This was a black student?
No, this is a white student. So that's not black. Right, to do, right? And then, you know, so you wear your hair a certain way. It's natural, but it's not like real black natural, you know?
What is
I
real
was
black natural?
whatever that means, right? So I, at that moment, as an educator in a
Right.
entirely white space, used that microaggression, which he didn't even realize was a microaggression, as you talked about, as a teaching moment. So that's what we need to do as educators as well. Not just we have to educate our, our fellow black people, but people who are not of color, who don't understand the black experience. We have to, in a polite way, teach them. So I had to explain to her what blackness looks like in its various forms, and the fact that the narratives that you see on television, because she was like from, I don't know, Bolton or something like that, where there's not very many black people, then goes to school in King, and everybody on campus is white basically in the program. I really had to take that as an opportunity to explain to her that this right here, this is a black face, but right there, right here, we're all black people, and there's not a particular narrative. So
Right.
we have to
We're not
use,
monolithic.
no, definitely not monolithic, and we have to use every opportunity as a moment to educate. Absolutely.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Dexter or Kwame, do you want to share that, speak to that?
One of the things I've learned over the last few years is to always consider my intentions versus the impact.
Yes.
So, as a teacher in the classroom, let's say, I may have the intention of doing something to help one of my students, but I may not be aware of the impact that my actions may have because it may cause more harm. And in the case of that young lady who you mentioned, maybe those actions caused more harm. So just to touch on your earlier question about what we can do, we have to really think about our intentions versus the impact
Absolutely.
that we have. And once you keep that in mind and you check your biases, it'll help you to move forward because we all have biases.
Right.
And racist ideas can be held by anyone.
Yes.
An inferiority complex can be held by anyone, especially those of the dominant
Right.
race.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, that's powerful. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a short break, a 5-minute break, and we're going to get back at 6 p.m. And Dexter, I'm going to start with you with the next question. Actually, no, not 5 minutes. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to come back at 6:05. And I really want us to begin to discuss the subject of streaming within the public school sector. So get your water. If you need to go to the washroom, go to the washroom. And here, do me a favor before you go. Share this link with somebody, because I'm sure you know some student or someone who can benefit from this. And we believe in sharing, because this information that is being shared, if we leave it to ourselves, then how can we impact the lives of those we're connected to? So I'm inviting you to share, and also share your experiences and your stories within the chat. And we'll see you at 6:05. Until then, stay plugged in. All right, welcome back to Live at 5. We are here for the second installment of the Where Do We Go From Here series with a focus on education and the Black experience. So as stated, I really want us to tackle the subject of streaming. Earlier this month, it was announced that the province of Ontario will begin to phase out grade 9 applied and academic streaming, beginning with mathematics classes in the fall of 2020. And this is a practice that I believe began around the year 1999. And before I ask my question to you, Dexter, I want to share I want to share a reflection that I saw in an article by Dr. Anthony Briggs, professor at Oakland University. He shared these words within his article. We had support from our brothers that the systemic practice of streaming reflects the microaggression, speaking more specifically to Black males, that Black males experience transitioning from school to work as they are denied and forced into a lack of employment opportunities. In other words, these exclusionary racial patterns have long-standing consequences that impact these men's livelihood. The jobs they viewed as being available to them involved physical labor. Any form of employment is better than unemployment. But such youth reflect a society where members of the dominant class, as we were discussing earlier, have access to more desirable employment positions, while young male members of racialized communities, especially those lacking formal job training or educational credentials, tend to internalize a view of themselves as being suited for physical labor along with its lower wages. Before I ask the question, I'll just also add some context in that as this reflection speaks more specifically to Black men, Dr. Briggs, his work, it focuses on some of the social factors that affect high school to work trajectory of Caribbean Black male youth. But we know that the practice of streaming, it doesn't affect Black men exclusively. It does affect them in significant ways. But I want to ask you the question, Dexter, what are your thoughts on this change that is being implemented? And even before going there, your thoughts on the practice of streaming and how it disproportionately affects Black youth. And as Dr. Briggs was sharing, it limits the likelihood of them being able to go on into some of the more economic streams of employment.
Thank you. This is a great question. So streaming happens in so many different ways.
Yep.
It's good that this is the first little step in trying to combat some of the pieces of anti-Black racism and oppressive systems that are in place within the schooling sector. But for me, for example, I remember, and I kept all my yearbooks, I remember my grade 9 year when I started, I had about, maybe there's probably 20 of us, Black males, my friends, that entered into high school. And by the time I graduated, only 3 of us finished. And of the 3 of us that graduated, I was the only one the day of graduation that was able to walk across because the other 2 had to do summer school, right? But that's just an example. There's an array of different things that caused that. But it was eye-opening to me in that moment alone, right? That some brilliant people that I interacted with weren't able to go through the process and finish. But with regards to what you're saying about streaming and the question, I remember I had a guidance counselor when I was in high school that was telling me that I should not apply to the universities that I was applying to. They were so convincing and they were so certain that no, just apply to college. Yep. And again, there's nothing wrong with college. But I knew from 7th grade that I wanted to be an educator. I knew that that was the path for me. I did the research. I knew the steps that I needed to take. Yep. Right? So when I was faced with trying to push me down a certain path, I was like, no, I'm not going to waste my money because I know for my my goal, my career goal, this is where I need to go. But it was like I had to fight and argue with the people who are supposed to be supporting me that this is the path for me and this is where I'm going to go. And I was successful, but I just reflect on that moment and think about how many other students did those educators influence to go down the path that maybe was not the path that they were interested or wanted to go down, right? So when you are streamed, if you're not aware of where that stream will lead you, it may lead you down a path that you never intended to go, or you were able or capable of doing something other, but you just didn't know or feel that you could attain it, right? Sometimes you know things that you can go for, but if you don't see anybody that looks like you, you don't see, don't have a mentor or understand the steps that you need to go through, it might seem like something that's not really attainable. Like, yeah, there's people out there that are doctors, but I don't know that I can be that, right? So it's really important that we combat these ideologies and we have mentors and people to look towards that we can see and say, okay, you know what? This is a path. This is how I did it, and these are ways that you can go.
Yeah, I think you said you summed that up so well, and you were speaking to the role that the guidance counselor played in trying to dissuade you from going to university. And I think, Giselle, I believe I overheard you saying that you had a similar experience, and I think that this is something that so many wrestle with, but without being informed as to the options and the resources, sometimes we can accept.
We do.
Right. We can accept what is imposed on us by such counselors. And may you speak to that, Giselle? Kind of your experience with that and how, whether it was mentorship or the role that perhaps maybe the church or other educators that you saw that looked like you helped in allowing you to resist and to pursue what you knew that you were capable of pursuing.
Thank you for this question, because I wanted to start out by saying, I found everything that I needed in the church, but I didn't. And I think that's a big problem that hopefully we can address later. But I have wonderful parents that when I came home and said, my guidance counselor said, I should go to college again. Nothing wrong, because I'm an instructor in that program. I have wonderful students. My mom was just like, well, what do you want to do? The conversation about post-secondary education, going to university, at the time I wanted to be a lawyer, those conversations had been going on since I was 3 and 4 years old in my household, So when I came home and told them what was said, my mom was just like, okay, and, so I wasn't even allowed to accept that. I had a very supportive mother and father again, who, when I was struggling through math, Dexter and I are born in the same year, so we were the guinea pigs for the streaming. Okay, so we were born in 1985, so you know how old we are, and we were the guinea pigs the first year. And
you would have been in what, 9th grade?
Yes, so we started as it was a very trying time, particularly math, science. So my mom saw that I was struggling. She got me a tutor, right? And I can say that I acknowledge that not everybody was able to do that for their child. So that's something I think that's important to say. But I had that positive reinforcement at home, where it's just like, okay, this is what they say, but this is what's going to happen. And we support you. And no matter what you want to do, if you want to go to law school, we support you. If you decide to go to grad school, we support you. Right. But you're going to be something. That was the expectation. Right? Failure wasn't an option. Accepting the options that were put forward to me by people who didn't know me or my context, it just wasn't allowed. So I think the roles of families, whether or not I understand there are economic challenges that many families have, fine, but as hopefully we'll talk about this later on, I believe that we should be able to create spaces in our churches to support people who need that help. So if your child is challenged in math, English, what have you, you can find somebody to support them because the church is a community, but again, we'll get to that hopefully.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely. Stella?
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think it's really interesting because, I'm sure parents would like to trust education systems with their children, and I think that's what we should do. But with Black students, with Black children, you can't. And I know for parents who don't necessarily know the system, it might be difficult for them to understand why an educator would say, no, your child would be better off, going down this stream. So that is those are scenarios that I also understand. And for me, I mean, once a Black kid does get to university, it doesn't get better. Anti-Black racism is still present within the university setting, as we've talked about. But I worked as a writing tutor for the football team. And I worked with a lot of Black students, and I made sure that I looked after the Black students that I had. And I had one kid come up to me and say, Stella, I'm not supposed to be here.
Oh, wow.
And I'm like, what do you mean? And he said, well, when I was in high school, my guidance counselor told me that I wouldn't be able to go to university. I'm not capable of going to university. And the guidance counselor did everything possible to get that kid to go down the applied track. Anyways, he's now in university, now a varsity athlete, and getting amazing grades, and is also an amazing writer. And when Black students are in university, they deal with a lot as well. I've had so many Black students come up to me, the ones that I worked with on the football team, come up to me and tell me, I'm not a great writer. Or when I would tell them, you're an awesome writer, you should take some writing courses, or you should just write. And they'd say, why do you keep saying that? And I'm like, because you're good.
Right.
And nobody had ever told them that before. So even once our students get to university or go to college, we still need to continue with that positive reinforcement and keep looking out for Black students, as Giselle has done with me, and other Black TAs at York have done, and professors at York, Professor Davis, Professor Johnson, all of my amazing TAs have done with me as well. And actually, they weren't even my TAs. They just saw me around campus and looked out for me. So, yeah.
No, that's excellent. That's excellent. Kwame?
Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your narratives. I'm thinking about a Black professor I had at U of T, Professor Joki Wan. And in my first year of my graduate studies, I was doubting myself. I'm like, listen, am I good enough? Am I a good enough writer to even be here and to write on the graduate level? She says, Kwame, this space is open for you.
Wow.
And you're welcome here, and you can do it. So on the note of positive reinforcement, it doesn't stop when you're 4 years old. You need to continue on to graduate studies, into your PhD. But I just want to expand our notion of streaming a little bit. Sometimes when we think about streaming, we think about grade 9. It doesn't begin there.
Right.
Come on.
Streaming begins in kindergarten.
Talk about it.
I have a son that's about to enter kindergarten in September. And there's a book that I saw at Indigo the other day. It's called The King of Kindergarten. And there's a young Black man on there with a crown on the front cover. And I was tempted to buy it. He has so many books, but I'll buy him that one anyway. Anyway, to all of our parents, aunties, uncles, grandparents, etc., you need to begin connecting with your child's teachers as early as kindergarten. Because once our children enter that door, streaming begins. He's acting up a little bit. Okay, we know what to do with that.
Right.
He's not speaking correctly. We know what to do with that. He's not regulating well. We know what to do with that. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that's the work that we do.
Right.
We're into child development and growth. And again, oftentimes our intentions are right. They're genuine. But we're not often thinking about the impact. Because there are programs that are set out for children that aren't regulating well.
Right.
And oftentimes that lends itself to them going into a special education program.
Right, right.
And we know we have so much data. I don't need to go into the data today. But I wanted to expand our thinking of streaming a little bit and really mention that it begins at the kindergarten level.
Right.
And as early as kindergarten, we begin to stream students. And we see it, grade 9, etc.
Right. No, and what I'm thinking of, and Dexter, it looks like you have something to share, so I'm going to pass it over to you after.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking of as you're speaking with it, starting at the kindergarten level, is the power of the labels. So we spoke briefly about it with the way in which children may act out at times, but the labels that children in kindergarten, grade 1, grade 2, the labels that are prescribed to them. And this child has learning deficiencies, and it's not to trivialize the reality of that, but some are labeled with things that they do not necessarily have, but so as to begin the streaming process, instead of having to deal with some of the other variables that you spoke to earlier, Kwame, that may impact the quote-unquote acting out of children, or what is deemed by some to be disruptive behavior, the cry for help, the cry for belonging, the cry for support. Sometimes these labels are given so as to avoid having to deal with any of those issues and avoid pulling out the resilience and pulling out the capability within the children, simply streaming them into realms and into areas within the educational sector that limit them in their ability to be able to perform at their peak as they grow toward the high school level. Dexter?
Yeah, no, and I just wanted to add and piggyback on some of Kwame's points. As early as grade 3 as well, when we do our standardized testing, those tests are used to decide, property value of areas. They're used to decide what jails we should build for how many years down the road, right? So the sector of education, it's one of the pillars within our society that reproduces and maintains the status quo within our society, right? So it's very, very important as well that parents, family members are informed with their power that they have. I've always used to say, from even when I was in the classroom, that my boss, the parents are my boss. That's how I look at it. But parents don't realize how much power they have in connecting with their administrators, connecting with the superintendents, the trustees, whomever it is, but also spending that time to get information from whether it be the school, but there's also agencies that are connected to schools and communities that will provide information. And something that Giselle said earlier was around her parents. I was very fortunate to have built-in role models, built-in from my parents, from my siblings who were older than me, and I have younger, and then also from the church. So growing up in the church, there were a lot of role models that I could see that looked like me, that were persistent and that would push you and say, go ahead, go with your school and make sure but they trusted, similar to what Stella said, they in that generation of growing up, they trusted educators, because my parents are from Jamaica, and in that setting of schooling, you trust your educators, you trust what they say. You're not going to really question and think, oh, they're telling me something that's actually detrimental to my child, right? So it was interesting to navigate through that, and a lot of advocacy I did on my own, but it's important that as educators, we allow families to know that you have a voice, your voice is powerful, and you have the ability to influence your child's educational experiences.
No, that's.
Can I make a point? I was looking
Absolutely.
for a quote from. I was looking for a quote that I read this morning, actually, written by Professor Carl James at York University. He was actually quoting another author who said that educational institutions are egalitarian, but they produce much inequality. And I think it's so important that we pay close attention to that, because it's come one and all, right? But we see now what happens when students pass through. You walked across at the end of the day out of 20 by yourself. So we have to pay attention to the fact that this whole concept of egalitarianism is still very much so full of inequality and inequity. It's very, very important. And I wish I was able to pull it up, but yeah, I thought that that came to mind when you talked about your experience.
No, that's powerful. And I was just informed that someone in the comment section asked the question, what is streaming? So can somebody just provide a definition as to what the practice of streaming is? And that's open.
To be completely transparent, I don't know the exact definition, but streaming is, so in the context of the streaming that you mentioned with grade 9,
Right.
There's different choices and options, right? So if you take applied courses, you're on the track towards going to college, right? That when you decide at the end of your high school experience, you will only be able to apply to colleges from your academic course, from your applied courses.
Right.
If you want to apply to university, then you have to take additional courses to upgrade your to be able to qualify. And then the academic stream is you're on track for university. Right. So
And there's also a track for trades, no? Is there a track for trades too?
As well. You have something to add, Kwame?
And in addition to applied, we have academic, which is more of the university stream, and we have locally developed.
Yes.
And what a lot of the data that we have has shown is students that enter a particular stream, such as the applied stream, even though there are pathways to get to the academic stream, many students don't take that pathway. And even though they can go to college, they don't even reach college.
Right.
Even though that's a pathway for them.
Right.
So there are many schools within the Toronto district that have already eliminated the applied stream. And students can only go into the academic stream, which is the stream to go to either university or college.
Right.
But the challenge with subjects like math at the applied level is, even if you want to go to an American university, American universities don't accept applied math.
Wow.
They only accept academic math. And many parents and students don't know that going into it.
Wow. Very helpful. Very helpful. Stella?
If I can just add, and you guys can correct me, anyone can correct me, but I really think that streaming is such a lazy practice on the behalf of school boards. Because like you said, I think it's C.W. Jeffries that eliminated streaming. So there's no applied route at C.W. Jeffries, and this is a school where there are a lot of black students, and so that school is really setting up black students for success. By the end of grade 12, you can decide if you want to go to university. You can decide if you want to go to college. You can decide, hey, I want to take a year off. But by the time you reach grade 12, you can make that decision. It's not like you're set up to fail. And that's what streaming does. And yeah, I think that the schools can and should provide resources for their students to succeed. You can have after-school programs, or you should have after-school programs. You should have lunch programs to help your students. And what streaming does, in my personal opinion, you just forget about the people who are going to be going to college. You don't pay attention to them because they're not, or who are in applied, they're not going to amount to anything. And you really see that dynamic. And I remember it so well in university, like feeling compelled to take, the maths and the sciences because I wanted to be seen, or I wanted the educators and the teachers and the school to see me as somebody who was serious. But ultimately, your school should be providing you with the right courses, the right teachers, and the right options to succeed, and for you to make that decision in grade 12. Not when you're 13 in grade 8, not when you're 13, 14 years old in grade 8, and you have to choose. And I remember that anxiety, like, oh my goodness, I have to think about my future right now. So anyways, yeah, and the TDSB has been thinking about or trying to find ways to eliminate anti-black racism since the 80s, right? We are now 2020. Do you know who was born in the 80s? Like Beyonce. Like this was a very, very long time ago, right? And again, it's just, I think, an unwillingness to do the work and an unwillingness to really deal with and confront anti-Black racism in education.
But also, Meikle, just to really respond to that question, so streaming is about, it's something that deals with predeterminism,
Yeah.
right? So it's like the word stream,
Right.
this way or that way. So in its very simplest form, when children are streamed from an early age, a decision is made that is often irreversible.
Right.
So this is the central problem of the discussion that we're having. So whether it occurs in grade 9, well, we know that it occurs really,
begins before.
it begins
Right.
before when they're 3.5, 4 years old in kindergarten. The decision that is made at that moment can alter the course of that child's life. So this is why the discussion is being had. So it's a good start, the discussion about removing streaming for grade 9, but it's much deeper than that.
Right. Going to the root. That's
Can I add? So, in my role before being a vice principal, for the past 3 years, I was an early reading coach. So I was in the board. I was a literacy coach. Essentially, what I did was I developed and worked with teachers throughout the board and the principals that had students that had the student population in the early years they were underachieving in literacy by a large number. So I was able to, for 3 years, go to a number of schools for months at a time. And most of my work as an educator has been in inner city schools, high-profile neighborhoods, Jane and Finch, Malvern. I was at the Afrocentric School for a number of years. And that experience and how students, Black students, are treated, it's one experience that it's tough. We speak about it a lot, but in this role that I was in, it was interesting because a couple of schools that I had were in affluent areas. So I had a school that was near Bridle Path.
Okay.
I had schools that were by Young and Shepherd, right? I've had schools that were near Markham, the edge of Toronto, right? So in those spaces, students that were in schools and neighborhoods that were known to be affluent, the few Black students were also experiencing anti-Black racism in a number of ways that were appalling. And they were being streamed towards behavior. Like this child is a behavioral problem.
Right.
But really, in all the other spaces I've been in, like this child is a model student. They're just 4. They're just 6, right?
Right.
So I think those are pieces around the conversations where don't think that just because your child is in an affluent area or an affluent good school, that they're not prone to experiencing these forms of oppression. And being very aware and thinking about how do you have conversations with your school to make sure that, and your child, to make sure that they feel safe, feel welcome, and that they're learning and growing. Right.
And I'm interested in hearing, Dexter, not to put you on the spot, but you mentioned a bit about how you were teaching in the Afrocentric school before. And I'm interested in hearing whether or not you saw some difference in the way that the youth responded to having representation and to having support from teachers who looked like them. And the reason why I asked that is because I had the opportunity for most of my, in fact, all of my formative years, primary school and secondary school, in attending, I went to like private Christian school, but all of the schools that I attended were primarily, there was a large Black representation, both in the student body and also in the representation of the educators, the teachers as well. And one of the things that I found within my experience, even at the high school level, is that excellence was the floor.
Yes.
Right? There was no context of you cannot do this. Right? There was no, and this is not to dismiss the reality of the majority, but to allow parents to know that there are other options, right? Which is why I want to hear a bit about that experience, because I found for me, in seeing myself represented in teachers, in having the support of teachers who said, no, you can go to the best of universities, you can do it, right? Having that example helped. And I know that that is not the experience of most, but I'm interested in hearing what your experience was like on the teaching side, seeing how some of the children and youth responded to that environment within the Afrocentric school.
So I was there for the first 5 years of the school, and during those 5 years of the school, it was one of the most amazing experiences of my educational career, and it was very powerful to be in a space where students knew, they felt belonging, they felt like they belonged. There was just this energy and focus, and every day was Black History, right? But it was also important that we didn't reproduce some of the errors that we saw within our society, right? So we had to also expose. There's a lot of, the school itself is you know, there's many different views that people have on it depending on their politics. But at the end of the day, my time there, my experiences there were very positive. Students that came there, a lot, again, they were from all over the GTA.
I can imagine.
All different socioeconomic statuses and beliefs. And it was just very powerful to see that. And I know that the students got a lot of that, a lot out of that. And I also did as an educator. And I remember saying to some of the team when I was working with them that I'll probably never work with such an amazing team again.
Wow.
And it's just, it was the time that we were there, and there was so much that happened that we had to build together. And like you said a while ago, Meikle, the expectations were high. We didn't accept that you weren't going to be successful or that you weren't going to do well. Whatever was necessary, we were willing to do. But I like that you brought up this question, because also I do like to bring up that there are alternatives, right? And that parents and families, if you feel that there's private schools, there's Christian schools, there's public schools, right? You have to think about what's best for you and your family and what you can do. But yeah, I think that school, when I was there, was very powerful. And I know many students that went off to do great things. And I'm grateful that I was able to be a part of it at the beginning.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. So we're going to shift gears a bit. We're going to talk, Giselle, you were kind of alluding to it a bit earlier, but we're going to talk a bit about the church and the role that the church plays within education and providing that sense of support to our children, to our youth, and to students. But I want to begin by asking each of the panelists, Kwame, we'll start with you and we'll work our way. How does your faith inform the work that you do as an educator?
Well,
your faith in Jesus.
Thank you so much for the question. One of the things I'm thinking about is the notion that your spirituality can help you transcend barriers that exist.
That's good.
And my spirituality, my faith, my belief has allowed me to transcend economic, racial, social barriers that exist.
Right.
I mean, I grew up in Toronto housing. And I'm not afraid to, share that.
Absolutely.
That experience. Right. When people think about, the youth that live in social housing, that's me.
Right.
That's my brother.
Right.
That's my sister. Going back to our family, though, we had a very supportive family unit. And our faith has always been the center for our family. So there are many youth that we're not talking about today. I'm thinking about the kids that I've worked with in Jane and Finch, Rexdale, the south of Scarborough, downtown, that aren't making it.
Right.
And one of the things I wish I could share as a public school educator is the notion of faith. So that's the trick. That's difficult to navigate.
Absolutely.
So for me, my spirituality has allowed me to transcend the barriers that I know exist. And I've held to the notion that, listen, I have a destiny. Right. I have a purpose in life. And it is my faith that has allowed me to grab hold of that.
Wow. That's incredible. Giselle?
Interesting question. I think that growing up in the church, and I do want to say, when I brought it up earlier, I should correct what I said. I received that same positive, go get your education and, make sure you go to university, do your courses, and be successful. So I did get that in the church. But I felt like I didn't see me
In the church.
in the church, particularly as a woman.
Right.
I didn't see me, right? So I'm a bit of an anomaly. As a black woman of Jamaican descent, growing up in the Jamaican Apostolic Church,
Right.
there is no me. And I think that was a struggle for me. But I knew that God wanted me to do something, and I know that sounds quite
Absolutely.
generic because he wants all of us to do something, but my something didn't fit in here. And I went on this journey to start reconciling my faith and my secular pursuits, because I kind of began to feel as though, why are they separate?
Right.
I mean, I love being on, praise and worship and being involved in serving in ministry in the sanctuary in that respect. But I approach my work as though I approach what we do here on Sunday morning. When I get up, drive my car, park, get into my classroom, I think about how I'm going to change and affect the lives of the students that are going to be in front of me today. And I broach that to my faith, as opposed to them being two separate things.
Right.
So me, the educator, me, the praise and worship leader on MWA,
one you.
It's one me.
Right.
And I do it all. But being an educator is not separate and distinct from what I call or what I was trained to understand to be ministry.
Right.
So for me, that's how I approach the work that I do.
No,
certainly.
that's so important. And I think there's something that I've heard Pastor Meikle share some time ago, and he said that our faith, our walk with the Lord, it's not something that's separate from our life outside of the church, but it sits as a covering and an umbrella that influences and affects every aspect of our life. So it's not that we have to compartmentalize our educational pursuits and our faith life, but it is one life, and the streams flow from that faith factor.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And by faith, we understand.
Right.
Right. So I want my faith to mediate my understanding, especially as a graduate student, because the academy, you have to really have a strong relationship as a believer with the
Absolutely.
Lord when you enter the academy.
Absolutely.
Right? So every time I read about, the politics of development and anti-black racism, international development,
Right.
and the role of, for instance, the Christian church in,
Right,
the
right.
perpetuation of the of slavocracy and plantocracy, I have to remember, that that's a particular kind of Christianity. My faith always informs that, because had it not, the academy would have led me astray, right? With its truth, but I know that ultimately, truth, as we understand it, comes from God, right? And my experience, the Spirit leads us into truth, and I had to remember that is the most important thing in my life that keeps me centered, for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Stella, I want to ask you this question. So as believers in Jesus, by nature, we worship, we pray, we study the scriptures and we seek the face of God. But what are some ways that you think that the church could provide could provide support to our children, to our youth, to students, in terms of allowing them to, whether that's in the area of mentorship, see representation? I mean, the beautiful thing about this panel is each of you bring a different perspective, but each of you embody and exemplify a portrait and a picture of blackness like that we don't always see in the media, right? I think we were speaking to that a bit earlier, how representation really informs the way that we think about ourselves, the way that we see ourselves. But my question, Stella, is how do you think that the church can be an agent in providing or leveraging some of those connections, whether that be through mentorship or academic strategy, or just that positive support for the students as they are rising?
That's an awesome question. I think mentorship is really important for students, university, high school, elementary. I've often looked up to people who were in positions that I wanted to be in, whether that be media, whether that be education. And I'm so blessed that throughout my education journey, I had, and I personally knew, a professor, a black woman professor, who attended Rhema.
Wow.
Professor Andrea Davis and now Professor Michelle Johnson attend Rhema. And I had Professor Davis in my first year. And I remember just going back to her class. You know, after second year, I was no longer in her class, but
Right.
I would go back to her class. And at church, I would see her at church. And on campus, when I would go to her office and I'd be like, Professor, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And I knew that her advice was coming from a place of faith.
Yes.
You know, she wasn't going to lead me astray with her answers.
Right.
She would pray for me at church. She would pray for me in her office sometimes.
Wow.
And that is extremely important, I think, for students and for Black children who go to church to have and to see. And on top of that, my coach, my track and field coach, he's also a Christian.
Right.
Right? A Black man who is a Christian. So in many areas of my life, you know, academic and also athletically, I was able, you know, just as I was about to quit, I was able to, you know, lean on these mentors for advice, but also, you know, they prayed for me, they spoke life into me, they mentored me, and that was extremely important. And in, you know, my own way, you know, I try to do that for the students that
Amazing.
I've worked with, that I talk to. And I try, like you said, Giselle, I try not to, it's been a struggle, but trying not to separate myself as, you know, Stella the Christian at church, Stella the athlete at the track and field center, Stella the student, you know, on campus, but to be one and to have God inform me, all of me. And when I did the Black History Month supplement this year, I opened it, the first words are, "Thank you, Jesus." And I was like, am I really going to do this? Am I going to do it? And I was like, just submit it. And so when you open it, the first words are, "Thank you, Jesus." And I think it was really important for me to do that because I wanted, you know, those reading this to know this is me. This is the work I created, and this is the God I serve, and to not be ashamed of that. And so to your point, mentorship, super important. I also think that, you know, counseling, mental health services in the church would be really important to have, and to not shy away from having those types of conversations as well. Yeah.
No, that's amazing. And I think one of the things that you really encapsulated with what you shared is the fact that our faith in God, as we allow him to utilize us where we are, right? Like we're able to see him in the same way that he used Dr. Davis, your track coach, right? Like that is ministry. Ministry is not relegated to a mic or a pulpit. And I want to speak to somebody and encourage you that as God is calling you, whether that is to education, whether that is to entrepreneurship, whatever the sector or the area is, as you allow your light to shine in that place, that is ministry. Don't feel that you're less than because you may not be seen as often within a Sunday setting, but as you're faithful where you are, that is ministry. Dexter, I want to ask you this question. I want to ask, and it's twofold. How has the church been an agent in helping you to foster a sense of Black resiliency, or how can the church be an agent in doing that for the generation that is rising?
It's a good question. I think one of the things is because we live in this society, we have to navigate it, right? So the way that society is currently set, there's so many images, there's so many ideologies that are just being placed, and we're bombarded with it over and over and over again until we start to internalize some of it, right? But the church is one entity, one body that can help to feed us with other forms of information, right? And sources of identity and strength and power, right? So for me, that has helped me as well. Same thing, like my family structure has supported me, but when I was going through school and I was seeing and I always had this complex of how I was being treated by teachers in disrespectful ways. That's how I took it. But I didn't get it because at home I'm respected. My parents speak to me with respect and they're respectful to me. At church, that's what I experienced too. So why am I coming here and you're treating me like this? I'm not sitting in the corner of the class facing a desk or a wall. So I had things within my psyche, within my soul that allowed me to combat what I was seeing and hearing all the time, right? So that also helped to build up a resiliency within me. You know, pastors that I've had were males, they were men, right? So I would hear and come and get their teaching. And that would also reinforce the pieces around, you know, you're more than, you're not less than, you're above, you're not below, right? These things, these principles, these concepts within me gave me strength and resiliency to combat and navigate the pitfalls that I experienced when I was a child. And even though I was a child, I did it not knowing that that's what I was doing.
Wow.
Right? So that's another piece. I think sometimes we don't give kids, students, enough credit for who they are and what they're doing. Sometimes they might not have the language, like I said earlier, or the ability to articulate it, but their actions and their behaviors demonstrate, you know, whether it be disagreement with it or that they bought into what it is that you're basically selling them, right? So it's important to look for a lot of different cues and forms of information to help inform what's going on. As kids go through different phases from child, infant to adolescent, behaviors change and we are figuring out ourselves and we're, you know, like we have to have compassion and love to see the child from birth, from however young, throughout the process and support as they develop, right? We're different as we go through different processes in life. And we have to believe in our kids and believe in each other and support. When we fall, not kicking each other, but supporting with love and compassion and reinstilling that belief that, yeah, you know what, you want to quit, you want to give up, but you can do it. I believe in you. I know you can do it. I've done it. You can do it too. Right. So those are some of the pieces I think that the church, and then in my instance, a lot of times in the church, it wasn't that I've done it. It's I believe in you. I didn't do it. You can do better than me.
You can be the one.
Right. And I would hope that, you know, when my kids come up, they surpass me. Right. And one thing that I want to bring up with this conversation as well is, you know, the notion of, you know, our boys, like, you know, when you're young, when you're born, oh, he's so cute, right? But at some point along the way, he becomes a threat, a danger, right? And how do we prepare our kids for, I hope I don't have to prepare my kids for the same things that I've experienced, but just in case our society and our world doesn't shift, how do we prepare this generation to navigate effectively through this society that, you know, deems us as dangerous or as a threat or a less than, right? It's a really, really tricky and tough piece, and I really, really want to say that, you know, I'm here, and I would say that I've been successful, but for every one of me, there's like a multitude of amazing people that I grew up with that were amazing people that now in society, if they're still alive, are not deemed as that, right? And how did that happen? And how do we ensure that that doesn't happen to this next generation? Because when I'm at work, I see myself in a lot of these students. I see, you know, I wasn't the nicest, greatest student. So that I love that now, looking back, because when I see that student, that child that, you know, people are saying is this bad child, this horrible student, whatever it may be, I know that there's hope.
Absolutely.
And my faith allows me to see those pieces and to work through it with the students and the families.
And one of the things that I want to say, if I might add to the conversation, in really giving honor where it's due, that the house that we all hail from, growing up, I had the privilege of growing up from I've been here since a child, you know, a part of the Rhema family. And one of the things that I've always seen is display, and I see it you see it at a pastoral level, but also within the congregation, right? There is a push, and sometimes it's not always spoken, but it's almost embedded within the culture that excellence is something that we as African Canadians are capable of. And even in seeing that demonstrated with people that I worship with, people that I converse with at church, having that inspiration, having that visibility, having that example, it has encouraged me to push and to know that even though there are barriers, even though there are systems, even though there are challenges, the faith factor, and I think, Stella, you were talking about it earlier, the positive reinforcements of family, they function as ladders to elevate and move beyond. Not to say that there is a dismissal or a lack of acknowledgement of the barriers. The barriers are acknowledged, but the support of the church, the support of the family, within my experience, has helped me to know that I am able to overcome some of those factors. So as we're coming down to the tail end of our conversation, I want to ask each of you panelists, within your respective areas of work and of expertise, how are you working to dismantle anti-Black racism, either as educators, as writers, as students? How are you working to do that? And how can parents and those watching, the youth watching, how can they be a part of that? So Kwame, we'll start with you and then we'll work our way.
Wow, powerful question. One of the things I've come to understand is that racist ideas can be produced or consumed by anyone.
Absolutely.
And a part of my commitment as an educator is to engage in these difficult conversations about race.
Right.
Anytime we begin talking about race, people are going to get uncomfortable.
100%.
And that's your body's natural response. So I think that, one, we need to understand how to engage in these conversations about race. And these conversations can happen at the dinner table.
Right.
But however, one thing that I want to encourage our parents and our community members to do is to engage with their local school board. I'm going to leave you with this. I heard it said to me last summer, the voices at the table are the voices that are heard.
Right.
The voices at the table are the voices that are heard. And yes, we can engage on social media. That's one form of mobilization.
Absolutely.
And I understand that. There's power in that. But as someone who can vote, someone who can write, someone who can speak, I encourage us to continue to make our voices heard at various tables across our city, province, and nation. So that's a part of my commitment as well.
That's excellent. And say there's a parent asking, how can I do that? Like, what's the first step? Maybe I haven't been as involved, but I want to. What are some of the first steps that they can do to do that?
Well, at the school level, we have our school council meetings. At the board level, there are monthly board meetings, and now they're all casted live, for everyone to see. So based on your jurisdiction, you can also engage in board meetings at home.
Right.
You should know who your local trustee is as well. These are practical ways to engage with your school board and your school staff as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Extremely helpful. Giselle?
Just to continue what you said there, Kwame, I also believe that education begins at home, too. As someone who studies anti-colonialism and understanding that education historically is not for us, I won't say I take issue with us entrusting our children into the education system, because I know that, it's a necessary thing for students to go to children to go to school, rather.
Absolutely.
But we need to take responsibility first as parents for the education of our children. It's not something that the teacher does. It's something that the teacher participates in, right? And I can say that because I came from a household where I learned about, I learned how to read and write at home from my mother, but like understanding my identity as a black woman, as being a part of the global African diaspora, as being a part of the Jamaican diaspora, that information, that knowledge was deposited into me at home, right? And I went to school and noticed that there was a deficit in that information, but at least I learned it from somewhere.
Right.
So I think parents do need to participate in that respect. So I know for me, how I try to dismantle anti-black racism in the work that I do is to be the counter-narrative to the images of black people that we see,
Right.
and to be the best version of myself, to be the version that God created me to be. Again, I know that doesn't sound quite deep, very deep, but at the same
It
time,
makes a difference.
I think it makes a huge difference to
Absolutely.
be the best. I don't ever want it to be said that I am occupying the position that I do because I am black.
Right.
Right? Because of affirmative action, or because of, all of this new symbolic anti-black racism that is emerging as a result of the uprisings. I work very hard daily to earn my keep and to maintain my position. So that is very important for me, so that it's understood that, and I think this goes for many of us, all of us who are in these positions, we need to prove ourselves. And I mean, other colleagues might not have to, but we need to make it clear that we belong here.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's very important to me. And as an educator, to take those moments to teach, not just the class, but one-on-one.
One-on-one
Yeah.
as well. No, that's so important. And I think one thing I hear with what you shared is owning the space that you're in, right? So, Stella and Dexter, how are you working to dismantle anti-black racism where you are? If you'd like to share also, how can parents and community leaders, youth, be a part of that?
Yeah.
And I'm going to, because we have just a bit of time left, I'm going to ask if you could share in maybe 30 seconds to a minute. So Stella, we'll start with you and then we'll end with you, Dexter.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it's important for me to hold these institutions accountable, for me to hold, the professors, the teachers who are clearly exhibiting very racist behavior accountable. And I would encourage the kids that I work with, or just any black student listening, to also do the same. And yeah, to not be afraid to use your voice, and to not be afraid to ask for them to be held to account for their actions and for their anti-black racism.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dexter?
For me, what I would say is, for me, I'm committed, and I'll always have the conversations when and where I see opportunities, and also creating opportunities for the conversations to happen. But I would say to families, to students, you have a voice. Use your voice. Your voice is powerful, and think about, people a lot of times think about when it's times for elections and voting and who we are electing.
Right.
We vote in trustees without even knowing who it is sometimes. We're like, oh, who's this person? Know who you're voting for. I know that politicians, we feel differently about it from time to time, but read up on them and figure out what makes the most sense for you and your family and for the community at large. It's important. We live in this world, so we should still pay attention to what's happening in it.
Be informed, stay informed. Powerful. Thank you so much for sharing. And as you're in the chat, I want us to give a hand for each of our panelists, Kwame Lennon, Giselle Thompson, Stella Isaac, and Dexter Morris. We had a wonderful conversation, and as I said, the conversation continues. So we invite you to join us for part 3 of Where Do We Go From Here, Saturday, August the 1st. Keep the conversation going, because we believe that we have the power to change. God bless you, and thank you for tuning in to Live at 5. Until next time, stay plugged in.